Hello there, Advanced Motion Design. This is Emily with another action-packed extrusion extravaganza. Well, maybe not really, but I do want to touch on a few things that we talked about in the last class and expand upon them. I've already done a dad joke, so just like that. I also felt like I had to do something different with this example. I'm embarrassed by how much this looks like Microsoft Word art. And also, just being designers, it's very rare that we're just going to be able to extrude a font just out of the box like this. More than likely, it's going to be a logo or something that somebody else has designed or we've designed, etc. So the first thing I want to talk about today is how do you go from Illustrator into After Effects? We've talked about doing faux 3D using Illustrator, where we extruded text and we extruded shapes. So this text, I've already created outlines. That's just an old trick in Illustrator, but while text is still editable, you can go in and change the type of font, the leading, etc. But once you create outlines, then that text becomes paths. And then those paths are something that you can edit individually. So when you create a path, we already know that vector paths in After Effects can be extruded. All text is inherently vector-based. So when we make a text layer in After Effects, we can extrude it because it's based on a path. All right, so I have this font here. I'm just going to change the color to something that we can see. And we did this in a previous class, but basically if something is vector-based, whether we use the text tool or our shape tools within After Effects. These are something that we can extrude, assuming that we're using the correct Cinema 4D renderer. So we get to that by having a 3D layer. So with text selected here, I'm just going to click in that little column where the 3D cube is. And I get my 3D handles there. If we look at our transformation properties, we have our X, Y, and Z and our orientation. All 3D objects have these material options. This is where we've been working with cast shadows. But when you work with the Cinema 4D renderer, then you also have these geometry options, and that's where extrusion lives. So it has to be a 3D layer, and it has to be using the Cinema 4D renderer. And in addition to that, it has to be a vector shape. You can't just extrude a picture of a cat and get a 3D cat, at least not yet. Regardless of what program you're using to create 3D, you're always going to need light in order to perceive the depth. And so if I go Layer, New Light, and just click OK on our default spotlight here, then we can actually see our extrusion and perceive that change in the depth itself along the Z. So all layers have the X and the Y, the width and the height, but when a layer is 3D, then we actually have that Z extension as well. So by having our light, we can perceive the depth of the object and adjust it accordingly. So we can do that with our vector text, but we can also do that with the shape as well. So I'm just going to turn this one off real quick here and scale this guy up by clicking on S for scale. And its orientation point, its anchor point is in the middle here, so it's scaled way over there, but that's okay. We can change that orientation point just using our pan behind tool. And if I hold down Command, I can actually have that snap to the middle or one of the other points, which is really helpful. Now when I scale it up, it will actually scale from that part. I want to say point, but for a star that seems like it'd be confusing. So if I make this layer 3D and then go to the Cinema 4D renderer, you can see just by being 3D, I'm going to turn off the alpha channel here, it's being affected by the light regardless of whether it's extruded or not, just by being a 3D object. But if I go to my geometry options and extrude, and then for this particular one, I'd have to rotate it since we can't really see what's going back there. I could turn the alpha channel back on too. But sometimes without perspective, which is kind of the other key ingredient with 3D, having just that change in view is going to really help. Also, just looking at it with multiple views, whether it's horizontal or vertical, and then looking at the top down or left, regardless of what 3D program you use, they all have features like this that really help you get a sense of where in the 3D space you are. I just usually use the 2 views, but you can even do 4. And it really just gives you a sense. You can tell from the upper left, top, front, right, active camera is what actually renders. But then when you're moving stuff around, I find it a little overwhelming to have 4 up. But having 2 for sure definitely helps when I'm moving the shape and just kind of understanding, like, I've got the light here in these different views. So it's all the same light, it's just different ways of looking at it. Now, chances are you are going to need to do more than just extrude basic vector shapes in After Effects. You might have a client logo or just some text that you've outlined and changed in Illustrator. So I have my text here that I can adjust. It's nice that it's editable, but I want to do something that's more defined or maybe aligned with the brand. So in Illustrator, I played around with a couple of different shapes, and I have my text here. I already created outlines for this one. I have this font called Bodini Ornaments that are kind of these different floral elements, so I didn't actually draw this lovely daisy, but I just wanted something fast and floral. That sounds like the name of a company. So when you first create outlines, it's one continuous group. If I double click on this, you can see within the group the individual letters. Now, whenever you're working with Illustrator and importing objects, you can import individual layers, but it has to be an actual layer. Anything with this greater and less than sign around it is actually just a path. It's not a true layer. So what I would want to do is I'm going to copy and paste that text into a different file altogether. But this technique of creating layers from paths is something that's helped me so many times throughout my career. So let me do this from scratch with this capital letter one here. So this is still editable type. I'm going to copy this and put it in a new window just because I have a lot of clutter here. This, by the way, is a lot like how I start when working on a logo. I have like different font options. I play around with kerning and leading. I look at different shapes, but I usually keep it kind of messy when I'm first creating something. Now that I have something more refined, I'm going to copy that and paste it into another document. And right now, this is an editable font. We can still highlight it and change different components of it. So if I wanted to increase the tracking, I could, or I could kern it or change the font still. Maybe I want this to be medium instead. And I create outlines, which I can do just by right-clicking. And I just want you to see the difference in the layer palette as I make these changes. So this is just editable text. If I right-click on it and create outlines, it's still one layer, but now there is a group within the layer. And within that group is several compound paths. So it's almost like Russian nesting dolls. We want each one of these to be a layer, but if we imported this right now, it would just be one. I'm going to save this file, and I'm just going to call this spring test. And it's still an AI file. It's important that it's a vector format for this technique, but you would do that anyways if it was a logo because you'd want it to preserve the quality. So I'm going to save this into my folder for this demonstration. And in After Effects, I'm going to go to my importing. You could go File, Import. I tend to double click in this gray space in the project window. And if I click on my spring text, we have our option of how we want to import it as. So if you choose footage and there are multiple layers, it's going to make you choose a layer or merge the layers. If you choose a composition, it actually lets you retain all of the layers. And I always like to retain layer sizes, otherwise those bounding boxes are the size of the document. So even with this, it gives me a composition, so it's still vector, but if we try to extrude this, if I make it 3D and go to my Cinema 4D renderer, if I twirl down these options and go to geometry, it just gives me curvature. And we saw this before when we were working with this image. I added the curvature to this background. If you make something that's not vector 3D, rather than giving you extrusion options and things like that, it just gives you curvature. And that is hideous. Now that it's a 3D layer, it's responding to the light. So I'm going to change that light color right away here to just white. It's like a Velveeta color. That's not good. And that's a little bright too. In the previous class, this was happening to me too. Normally, you should just be able to double click on a spotlight. Mine's making me go up to light settings. You got to pick your battles though, so I'm just going to go with it. Alright, so I have this light that's not too blinding. I also was playing around with this and added a lens flare. I added it to an adjustment layer just so that it appeared on everything below it rather than being attached to one bounding box. But I can come back to that. That's not important here. But if we make a layer 3D that doesn't have any vector paths to it, it just gives you the option to add curvature to it. So if I go to multiple views, doesn't really matter which direction, but if I rotate this along the Y right now, you'll actually be able to see kind of into it. It almost creates its own little cyclorama. It's like just this curved background. And this can create a lot of different cool effects. The light's kind of dramatic right now. I'm going to scale this up a little bit. And then, of course, we can have the spring cast shadows. That's not turned on currently, so our material options that we've been working on since the beginning of the semester, that's where we find things like our cast shadow. And my computer is thinking really hard about this basic command. Oh, there we go. Because that's how drop shadows work, is on the sky. But I hope you get the idea from this review here. So essentially something that's not vector is just going to have you curve it. And that's how you can kind of test something. So it's an AI file, but if I try to make it 3D and go to geometry options, it just has curvature, not extrusion. So it's not what we want. So this one's no good either. Now there is another thing that you can do, and it might not have the outcome you expect, but what about copying and pasting into After Effects? Technically, the only thing you can copy and paste into After Effects is text. You can't copy and paste an image because it's all file path based, so it has to be something you import into the program. However, if you copy a vector path and paste it within After Effects, you need to have something to paste it onto. So I'm just going to make a solid here. And let's make it not white. This could be any kind of image or asset, but if you paste a vector shape onto another layer, you actually create masks. Let me turn off the shape layer here. And if we scale this up, it actually created a mask for each letter. I'm going to turn our background back on here, but you can see that different colored kind of path around each one. If I twirl down this solid or click M for masks, you can see it created a mask for each letter, not just each letter, but the knockouts too, like the in-betweens. So like this P and the R have two masks, one on the inside and one on the outside. So any one of these masks, I could go in and feather. I can expand the expansion or opacity. It's kind of cool when you expand it because then it interacts with the other masks. We have this that we can do all these different effects to, but you can also just paste it onto an image if you wanted. If I create a new comp here, and I dragged that lovely spring image in. If I was to paste, I would actually be able to mask that shape with those paths. And it is kind of confusing when you have all these various lines. Remember, you can, especially when you're zoomed out, it's kind of hard to see what's going on. You can turn those off at any time by going to View Show Layer Controls or Shift Command H. If you do Shift Command H, you can turn those bounding boxes and paths on and off. In addition to text, if I go back to one of my earlier examples here, I have this leaf pattern here. I'm just going to copy this, and each one of these different shapes is going to be a separate mask. So if I go back into After Effects, I'm going to create a new solid here. I'm just going to make a green solid. And I'm going to call this leaf. And on the solid, I'm just going to paste, because the last thing I copied was my leaf pattern here. And if I click S, I can scale up. And so I have this object now, but what's cool is that I can apply effects to it and do whatever to it. So like if I wanted this to have more detail, I could go to my effects and presets and type in gradient and add like a gradient ramp or something else to this. That is the ugliest gradient ramp it could have possibly chose. I was like, oh, it's going to be beautiful, and it's not. Well, let's change that. Let's get some nice greens going in here. And with the gradient ramp, you can change the beginning and end of it. So you've got these points where I can say I want it to start down here and end over there. So you can have this nice little flow to that. And then this is something that, of course, we could add a drop shadow to, etc., to give it the illusion of 3D. And with this shape, like I said, we did mask an object to it, but we can also apply whatever. Like if we wanted the same gradient ramp applied to this, we could do that pretty easily. So there's a lot of ways of working with vector paths inside After Effects, in addition to the ones we can create within the program. However, if we wanted to get those vector paths from Illustrator into After Effects and be able to extrude them, it's going to take a few extra steps. The first step is just making sure that each one of these paths is actually its own layer and not just a compound path. Once you've outlined your text, you can see you've got these compound paths, but they're all within a group. We're going to take the middle management out of this situation before we create individual layers. Otherwise, it's going to create this as an individual layer. So I'm just going to right-click on my shape and ungroup it. And ungrouping is just going to take away that kind of subfolder and give us just the compound paths themselves. Now I'm going to click on my layer. And if I go to my little 3 option arrows over here to the right of the layer palette, I have Release to Layers Sequence and Release to Layers Build. Sequence is going to give us each one of these compound paths as its own individual layer, whereas Build is going to build up on the previous one. So we would get S, then SP, then SPR, etc. That's because we can actually export layers as frame-by-frame animation in Illustrator, but when you have a program like After Effects, that's not really the most convenient way to go about things. So I'm going to choose Release to Layers Sequence, and I want you to notice how this compound path text changes. So when we choose Release to Layers, now they're actually individual layers. They say layer, and they don't have those greater than and less than signs. So if we click on an individual one, we can see that layer. So I could rename these or reorder them. I could also just select these layers and pull them out of layer 1. That original layer is just going to be empty now. We don't actually need that original one. So I'm just going to delete that. And I somehow nested I within R. Let's just pull that out. But it's all about hierarchy. So we want each one of these letters to be equal in the hierarchy as far as where they are in the layer palette. They're not within another layer. They're not embedded in each other. And I'm just going to reorganize them quick. Now this might seem like a lot of work, But being somebody that's had to separate the letters of much longer words by hand, release to layer sequence is a awesome shortcut. I'm just going to go in and rename these to be the letters themselves, just because then when I'm playing around in 3D, it will be much more clear which thing I'm working with. Okay, so I have my individual layers that are named and in the right order, though honestly the order is really important to us, not the computer. I'm going to save my file, and back in After Effects, I am going to import this AI file. Now, I definitely want to have my individual layers, so I'm going to choose Import As, Composition, Retain Layer Sizes, otherwise my bounding box will be the size of the stage. I want it to be the size of just the individual letters. I'm going to click Open, and then it creates that comp, so I'm just going to double click on it, and it looks like it's all black because we have a black background. So now I have individual letters in, and this in itself is useful. If you wanted to animate these without having to worry about the other ones, this is a good way of creating those assets using Illustrator. But we want to be able to extrude these. And even though these are Illustrator layers, and you would think they're vector, they still don't count for extrusion. So if I select just one of these and click on my cube for 3D, and go down to geometry options, I get the curvature again, which is how you know it's not a vector shape. But if I right-click on these, I'm right-clicking on all of these layers. I have them selected, but this could just be an individual layer as well, of course. So if you right-click and go do this menu, under Create, there's Create Shapes from Vector Layer. Shapes are one of those default vector objects within After Effects, whether you're working with the pen tool, the shapes, or the text itself. So if I go to Create Shapes from Vector Layer, now you can see that we get double the layers, and therefore double the fun and confusion. So we still have our original Illustrator layer. You can see it by the icon, but now we have S outlines, P outlines, R, etc. I'm actually going to delete the Illustrator ones. I'm just going to Command-click to select those. I could just hide them if I want, but it's easier in this case just to delete. And I know this doesn't look any different to us, but to the computer now this is actually something that we can extrude. So this is a vector shape that we can go to and click on 3D. I'm doing it for all these layers at once. You can see all their axes pop up there. And if I rotate my object, now I probably don't want to rotate these all individually because they're all separate. So in this situation, I'd probably want to create a null that I can control everything with. So nulls can also be 3D so that they have the same kind of attribute. So I'm just going to go Layer, New, Null Object. And let's make that 3D. And let's parent all of these other layers to it. So I'm going to Shift-click and either pick with them or click on this drop down to choose the null. And then when I have the null selected, whatever I do to the null, all the other layers will respond to that. This isn't text anymore, it's the shape, so if I want to change the color, I can always just select them and go up to the fill and stroke options here. I'm just going to choose a light blue. Then when we extrude this text, we'll be able to see it more clearly. It's really hard to see when black is extruded. So I can go through and do these individually. We can make these layers 3D. And when we go to things like our geometry options, we can extrude them. And if we throw a light on that, then we could see our lovely 3D text. Now, I did this with text that really just looks like it came from After Effects again. So, just quick review. I have this other text that I already worked on. So this text, I already did those steps too. I created outlines, I copied it into a new file, I released the layers into a sequence, and this one I did not rename my layers or reorder them. So you can see that's sloppy, but bear with me. So if I copy and paste this into After Effects, it's just going to make a mask. I don't need to save it as anything special. I'm just going to save it as an AI. By the way, if you save this as an EPS file, same thing's going to happen. It's not going to recognize the vectors. It's just going to try to create curvature. So I have my Illustrator file saved, and then within After Effects, I'm going to import that file. So I'm going to create a new composition based on this file, and I have just one Illustrator file. I don't have individual layers. But if I right-click on this and go to Create and Create Shapes from Vector Layer, I can create outlines of just the whole thing. So if like the individual letters aren't important to you, you don't need to do that extra step. Like you can just bring in an Illustrator file and then convert it to shapes, because now this is something that I can make 3D. If it has that little star next to it, that just means it's a shape layer. Anything else is going to be an image of some sort. When I actually use a shape tool within After Effects, it has that same icon. So anytime you see a little star next to a layer, that means it's a vector shape, which also means that it's something that can be extruded. So I'm just going to go, I could delete that original one, go here, and one last time, click on my 3D cube, go to Geometry Options, I can extrude it. I need to have a light. Let me change this color here. I don't know if that's any better, but you can see we have our 3D object here, and it's a custom one from Illustrator as opposed to just something that we did within After Effects. So there's a few different ways we can do it. Just keep in mind that copying and pasting equals a mask, and you can release layers to create individual ones. Otherwise, you can bring the whole thing in and right-click on it and create vector shapes out of those layers. So if I have an Illustrator file in here, I can right-click, create shapes from vector layer. Is how you're going to be able to extrude any one of those paths. And I think I'll leave it for there today, but in the next class we'll talk about creating extrusions and full 3D shapes within Photoshop, so stay tuned.